My name is Daphne. I'm 37 years old and I live in the state of Arizona. This incident happened about 6 years ago, and to this day, I still can't understand what happened that night. I've never really believed in those things, always been more skeptical, but after what happened on that road, I can't drive alone at night without remembering that horrible feeling. At the time, I worked as a legal assistant in a small town called Holbrook. That day, I had stayed late at the office, trying to get some work done before an important hearing. By the time I finished, it was already past 11 p.m. I still had to drive for almost an hour to get home, which was in a more secluded area, so I didn't hesitate and hit the road. It was a route I knew well, a nearly deserted highway with few lights and hardly any cars passing by at that hour. I was listening to some quiet music and trying to stay focused because I was tired and just wanted to get home. That's when I heard a strange sound. At first, I thought it was some noise coming from the car, maybe something loose vibrating with the movement. But after a few seconds, I realized it wasn't a mechanical sound. It sounded like crying, a muffled cry coming from inside the car. My body froze instantly. I slowed down and tried to figure out where the sound was coming from. I looked in the rearview mirror, looked at the back seat, but saw nothing. I wanted to believe it was just in my head. Maybe the wind, maybe fatigue. But then the crying got louder. It wasn't a baby's cry or a child's. It was rougher, stranger, like someone trying to hold the sound back, like a stifled sob. My heart started racing. I pulled over to the side of the road, took a deep breath, and turned on the interior light. I looked behind me and checked every corner of the back seat. Nothing. Just my purse and some paperwork from work. The sound stopped. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to decide whether I should keep going or if I was just losing my mind. I decided it was better to keep going. Maybe I was just too tired and hearing things. I got back on the road, trying to forget about it. But then, a few minutes later, the crying came back. And this time, it was coming from the trunk. My stomach turned instantly. It was impossible. I was alone. I had locked the car myself when I left the office. No one could be in there. But the sound kept coming, muffled, as if someone was inside trying not to be heard but couldn't hold back the sobbing. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking on the wheel. I didn't want to stop again in the middle of that desolate road. But the idea of continuing to drive with that sound in my car was even worse. I grabbed my phone, thought about calling someone, but who? What was I going to say? That there was crying in my trunk. So, I did what seemed to be the only option. I stopped again. I got out of the car quickly, went to the back, and unlocked the trunk with the remote. My hands were sweaty, and I swear I hesitated for a few seconds before lifting the lid. When I finally opened it, there was nothing inside. Nothing but the usual stuff I carried, an old blanket, a toolkit, a broken umbrella. My chest was rising and falling fast. I didn't know what to think. I slammed the trunk shut and stood there in the middle of the road, trying to understand what was happening. The only thing I could hear now was the wind blowing through the bushes around me. I went back inside the car, took a deep breath, and decided I just wanted to get home. I started the engine, gripped the steering wheel, and kept driving. This time, the crying didn't come back, but I could still feel something strange, a horrible feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Each minute on that road felt like an eternity. I could feel the air thick inside the car, like something was watching me. I avoided looking in the rearview mirror, avoided any sudden movements. I just kept driving. When I finally got home and parked in the garage, I stayed there, sitting in the driver's seat, trying to catch my breath. The silence around me was almost deafening. After that night, I avoided driving alone so late. But what still scares me to this day is that a few weeks later, something happened that left me even more confused. A colleague at the office casually mentioned that the road I had driven that night was known for strange stories. He said that years ago, a car was found abandoned on the shoulder, its engine still running, but no one inside. The owner was never found. Since then, I wonder, what if that night I wasn't just hearing a sound? What if something or someone was really there with me? I'll never know. My name is Mitchell. I'm 42 years old and I live in Colorado Springs, Colorado. What I'm about to tell you happened nearly 15 years ago, but it still haunts me like it happened yesterday. Back then, I worked as a sales representative and spent a lot of time on the road, traveling from city to city. Driving long distances was never a problem for me. In fact, I even liked it. But that night, something happened on the road that made me question reality itself. It was late October, and I was heading back from a business trip in Utah. I was driving a black rental sedan, and my destination was home. The GPS said I'd arrive in just over 5 hours, but there was no traffic, so I figured I could make the trip a bit faster. Around 10 p.m., the road was completely empty. It was just me, the asphalt, and a dark sky with no stars. The only sound was the car engine, and every now and then the rustling of the wind through the dry shrubs on the side of the highway. After a while, I noticed a lone streetlight by the side of the road. It was one of those old wooden poles with a flickering yellow light at the top. I didn't think much of it, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, something caught my attention. The pole seemed identical to the one I had passed a few minutes earlier. I thought maybe there were several poles like it along the road, although it was strange because streetlights aren't typically common in such remote areas. I kept driving, and the feeling began to grow. 10 minutes later, there it was again, the same pole with its flickering light. I looked at the GPS, thinking I might be lost, but the route still pointed straight ahead, no turns or exits. I started to feel an uncomfortable tightness in my stomach, that strange feeling when something just doesn't seem right, but I tried to push it away. I'm tired, it must be nothing, I thought. Another half hour passed, and to my surprise, the pole was still there. It was the same one, same flickering light, same position on the road. By now, I knew something was wrong. My GPS said I was driving straight with no deviations, but it was as if I was stuck in a loop. To test it, I mentally marked a dry bush near the pole. I kept driving for another 15 minutes, paying close attention to the surroundings. When the pole appeared again, I looked to the side and saw the same dry bush in the same spot. I pulled over to the shoulder and tried to control my breathing. My heart was racing, and a cold sweat was dripping down my neck. I grabbed my phone to check the map, but there was no service. The GPS kept showing the same route. I took a deep breath and decided to keep going, but this time more carefully. I drove for at least another hour. The sky remained dark, without moon or stars. The road was still the same, straight, empty, and silent. But the pole, it was still there. I could see it in the distance approaching, and each time I passed it, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just unease anymore, it was fear. In a desperate attempt, I decided to test something else. I slowed down and started counting the seconds out loud. When I passed the pole, I mentally marked the time. I drove straight, without making any turns, my eyes locked on the road ahead. Exactly 7 minutes later, there it was again. Identical. As if I had never left the spot. I couldn't think clearly anymore. My hands were shaking on the wheel and my mind was trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I turned off the car, got out and looked around. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just the flickering light of the pole. The night air felt colder, sharper, and the smell of dry earth filled my lungs. I walked a little further from the car, just to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. I walked about 50 meters down the road, never taking my eyes off the pole. When I turned to head back to the car, I felt a weight in my chest. Even though I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything moving, I had the unmistakable sensation that I wasn't alone. I hurried back and got in the car, locking the doors. I started the engine and accelerated, not caring about speed or rules anymore. Desperation was all I felt. I just wanted to get out of there. The speedometer passed 120 km/h, and my mind kept repeating like a mantra, "This isn't real. This isn't real." After a few more minutes, I risked looking in the rearview mirror. The pole was still there in the distance, but something was different. The flickering light seemed brighter, like it was watching me. My stomach twisted. Then, suddenly, everything returned to normal, without explanation. The GPS updated on its own, showing a city just a few kilometers ahead. I glanced in the mirror, and the pole had disappeared. The road now seemed different, more real, more solid. I got home in the morning, exhausted, with the feeling that I had just woken up from a nightmare. I've never been able to explain what happened that night, and I never found any similar stories when searching online. All I know is that to this day, every time I see a lone streetlight on the road, my heart skips a beat. My name is Lucas. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Portland, Oregon. The story I'm about to tell happened about 8 years ago, but to this day, I get chills just remembering it. I was returning from a business trip, driving down a deserted road, very late at night. The feeling of exhaustion was overwhelming. The trip had been long, and the thought of getting home was all I wanted. The road was completely empty, with no other cars in sight, and the dense fog was beginning to settle in. If I stopped to sleep, there was no safe place to do so it was better to keep driving. I was forcing myself to keep my eyes open, but fatigue was getting the better of me. When the car's clock hit 3:45 a.m., I couldn't think straight anymore. My body was almost on autopilot, following the familiar path. The road seemed endless. Suddenly, something caught my attention. Something by the side of the road, something that made me squint to see it better. A child. She was standing there by the side of the road, holding a doll. At first, I thought it might be a trick of perception or perhaps a hallucination caused by fatigue. But soon enough, I realized that the image was clear. The child appeared small, about 6 or 7 years old, and she was wearing a simple coat, but she seemed neatly dressed, which only made the situation stranger. There were no adults nearby, nothing that could explain why a child was alone there in such an isolated place. That sight immediately disturbed me. Thinking of helping her, I pulled over. The headlights illuminated the child, and immediately she looked at me. It was a gaze I couldn't quite understand, something distant, empty, but at the same time it seemed as though she had been waiting for me. I looked around to see if anyone else was nearby, but there was no one. The road remained silent and deserted. I rolled down the car window, hesitantly. "Hey, are you okay? What are you doing here alone?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. The child didn't answer right away, only continued to watch me. Her eyes were large, dark, and there was something disturbing about the way she stared at me. I didn't know what to expect, but the silence stretched on, like a growing feeling of discomfort. "You should have kept going," she said softly, but as clear as the fog that surrounded us. The phrase didn't make sense to me, but it made me even more uncomfortable. I swallowed hard, trying to understand what she meant. What should I have kept going for? And why was she telling me this? A shiver ran down my spine. Fear began to take shape inside me, but I was still so confused that I couldn't move. I tried to respond, but my voice faltered for a second. Before I could ask anything else, the doll she was holding slipped from her hands and fell to the ground with a dull thud. That doll, for some reason, seemed important. The child, the doll, the disappearance. Everything seemed to focus on that toy. I looked at the doll lying on the ground, still trying to make sense of what was happening. When I looked back at the child, she had simply vanished. It wasn't a simple turn or a quick dash to somewhere. She disappeared, as if she had been erased by the fog. There was no sound of footsteps, no movement. I found myself alone, with the empty road ahead and the doll lying there by the side of the road. The feeling of emptiness was even more frightening than any scream or noise I could have heard. It was as if everything around me had become darker. I looked at the passenger seat where the doll remained, and then felt a weight on my chest. What the hell had just happened? The child, the doll, the disappearance. None of it made sense. I looked around again, trying to find any trace of the girl, any sign that she had walked away, but there was nothing. The road was deserted, as if the event had been an illusion, a hallucination, but something inside me knew it hadn't been. I stood still for a few minutes, just staring at the doll. The feeling that something was wrong, very wrong, didn't leave me. I knew there was something there, something strange that shouldn't have happened. A sense of urgency took over me. Without thinking twice, I started the car and drove away as fast as I could. The sound of the engine cutting through the silence of the road, but my mind was in panic. What should I have done? Why did I stop? The next day at dawn, still in shock, I tried to research that road. Maybe it was something common. Maybe there was some explanation for it. some story, some strange phenomenon. I looked for local legends, something that could make me understand what I had seen, but I didn't find anything. The only thing I found was an old report about a fatal accident on that road, but the story didn't fit. There were no records about children being alone or any kind of paranormal activity in the area. I couldn't stop thinking about those words. You should have kept going. They stayed with me, etched in my mind. Every time I tried to think about what happened, it felt like a weight suffocated me. How had I stopped? Why hadn't I just kept going? It was as if she knew something I didn't, as if she had given me a warning, some sort of caution. In the months that followed, I tried to ignore the incident, but the feeling that something was watching me never left. Every time I drove down that road, even during the day, I felt a presence, as if the fog had never really gone away. At night, when I closed my eyes, I saw that gaze, the child's big dark eyes staring at me, telling me to move forward. I started avoiding the road, taking alternative routes, anything to not pass by there again. The worst part of all of this is that the doll was still with me. I had left it in a corner of my living room, but for some reason I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I knew it was silly, but there was something very wrong with it. For weeks, I felt like something was out of place in my house. Sometimes I'd hear something fall on the floor, and when I checked, I wouldn't find anything broken, but the feeling of being watched would grow. The doll seemed to change position, and every time I looked at it, I felt like it was watching me. It left me completely unsettled, not knowing what to do. Then one night, while I was sitting in front of the TV, I heard the sound of the doll falling to the ground again. I went to the living room, and to my surprise, the doll was lying face down, as if it had been deliberately knocked over. I stared at it, and for the first time, I felt a chill so strong that I could barely breathe. I tried to tell myself it was just in my head, but in that moment, I realized that something much more sinister was at play. To this day, I can't understand what happened that night. I don't know if it was a hallucination, a waking nightmare, or if I really saw something beyond logical explanation. All I know is that after that, my life was never the same. And even now, from time to time, when I drive down deserted roads, I feel that chill, as if someone is watching me, waiting for me to make the right choice. Keep going or stop. My name is Finian, and I'm 32 years old. I've always been the type who never really believed in those horror stories everyone shares, until I had an experience that completely changed my perspective. It happened about 3 years ago, and even now, when I think about it, I still get chills down my spine. It was an autumn afternoon, and I was driving alone on a desolate highway in the Nevada countryside. The kind of road you only find when you decide to leave the beaten path and explore. I had just left a small town, heading to the next one, and there was hardly anyone around. I was listening to music, taking my time, enjoying the solitude of the road. Then suddenly, my car made a strange noise, followed by a weird sound, and the dashboard lights went out. I pulled over to the side of the road and tried to restart the car, but nothing happened. I didn't know much about mechanics, so I had no choice but to think of other options. My first instinct was to ask for help, but there was no cell signal. I was literally alone out there. I looked ahead and saw a gas station in the distance, almost like a tiny speck on the horizon, but it seemed like my only option. I figured it was only a few miles away. It was either that or wait hours for someone to show up, which I knew wasn't going to happen. Hoping to get there quickly, I got out of the car and started walking. The sun was beginning to set, and I knew the walk could take a while, but nothing I couldn't handle. I was used to walking. At first, it felt fine. The air was cool, and the sky had that orange glow from the late afternoon. But as I walked, I started to notice something strange. No matter how long I walked, the gas station never seemed to get any closer. I'd look ahead, and no matter how far I walked, it seemed like the gas station stayed the same distance away. I started to sweat and get tired, but still, with every step, the hope of reaching it was what kept me going. The ground around me was empty, lifeless, nothing but the road and sparse vegetation. But it was when I realized that the sound of my breathing was the only sound I could hear that the fear started creeping in. There was nothing else. The silence was absolute. and that was unsettling. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached a sort of abandoned toll plaza with some rusted posts and a broken ATM. In the distance, the gas station I thought I had seen earlier was still there, but with something wrong about it. It looked different. The building seemed even further away, but with a blurry vision, like my brain couldn't quite grasp what I was seeing. The feeling that something was off grew with each step I took. I approached it, but the closer I got, the more I felt like I had been there before. The gas station, with its dim lights, didn't seem welcoming at all. It was like it was floating between the limits of my perception. Something was telling me I had been there before, but I couldn't understand why. I tried looking around and realized that my car, the only one I had seen there, was no longer on the road. The confusion paralyzed me. My car had vanished. My mind went into panic mode. I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. How was I already here if I had just walked for miles? It didn't make sense. I looked behind me, but there was no sign of the road I had come from. It was like time had stretched, making me walk in a loop, where the gas station was always just out of reach, and now it was right in front of me, but with no explanation. I went inside the gas station, looking for answers, but the feeling of disconnect was almost unbearable. The attendant was there, but he didn't seem to see me. He was just going through the motions, or at least pretending to. I asked him if he'd seen my car, but he just looked over my shoulder as if he wasn't hearing me. The silence was deafening. It was like, somehow, I was in a place where time and space were merging in a strange way. Desperate, I left the gas station and ran to the road, hoping to find some explanation. When I finally looked back, the gas station had disappeared, as if it had never existed. I was alone, in the middle of the road, with no car, no nothing. The only thing that remained was the feeling that the place, that gas station, and everything that happened there had been nothing but a living nightmare. And all that was left was an overwhelming sense of emptiness. I never understood what happened that day. It was like time had played a trick on me, making me walk endlessly until I reached a point that felt both familiar and strange. There was no explanation. I looked around, but everything seemed to dissolve as I looked at it more closely. And somehow, when I returned to my car, it was there, parked in the same spot I had left it. The only thing that had changed was me. To this day, whenever I pass that highway, I get a chill. Not because I'm afraid that it might happen again, but because I know that what happened wasn't just a lapse in perception. Something about that place, that path, simply didn't fit. And that's why I'm not the same person anymore.